There is a particular kind of exhaustion that has nothing to do with the body. It is the exhaustion of a mind that will not stop negotiating with itself. You lie awake replaying a conversation that ended hours ago, rewriting your own lines, prosecuting a case no judge has asked you to bring. This is not thinking. This is the mind mistaking motion for progress, the way a wheel spinning in mud believes it is driving forward. Marcus Aurelius understood this trap 2,000 years before neuroscience gave it a name. Alone in his tent on the frontier of the empire, surrounded by war and grief, he wrote to himself. Not for an audience, not for glory, but because he needed to catch his own mind before it caught him. Confine yourself to the present, he told himself again and again, as if the thought would not stay still unless he nailed it down each night. He was not a man untroubled by thought. He was a man who had learned that an untrained mind will devour its owner given the chance. This is where our first principle begins. Lesson 1 asks a question most people never think to ask. Why does the mind repeat itself? Why do you replay the same worry 100 times when the first replay taught you nothing new? Modern psychology calls this rumination. The mental habit of returning to a problem not to solve it, but to feel falsely that you are doing something about it. Studies on anxious cognition describe it as an attempt at control that produces the opposite. The more you circle a fear, the more real and permanent it comes to feel, even though nothing about the situation has changed. The mind confuses repetition with resolution. It believes that if it thinks about the problem enough times, from enough angles, it will finally arrive somewhere new. It rarely does. It simply wears a groove deeper into the same fear. The Stoics diagnosed this centuries before it had a clinical name. Epictetus, born a slave and freed into a life of teaching, put the matter with brutal clarity. Men are disturbed not by the things which happen, but by the opinions about the things. Notice what he does not say. He does not say events are painless. He says the event is not what tortures you. Your endless internal commentary on the event is what tortures you. The wound closes. The mind keeps picking at it. Here is the moment you may recognize before you are ready to admit it. You have spent hours rehearsing a conversation that has not happened yet, certain that if you think through every possible response, you will be safe from being caught off guard. And yet, when the moment came, it never unfolded the way you rehearsed. The hours were not preparation. They were a performance for an audience of one. And that audience never left the theater to see how the real scene played out. Picture the mind as a hall of mirrors. Step inside expecting to see a single reflection, and you find yourself multiplied endlessly, each image slightly distorted from the last, each one convincing you it is showing you something true. You do not escape a hall of mirrors by staring harder into the reflections. You escape by walking deliberately toward the single door you know is real. The Stoics called this door the present moment, the only place where action, rather than imagination, is possible. The practical discipline Marcus practiced was simple enough to use today. When a thought returns for the third time with nothing new to offer, ask it directly. What decision are you asking me to make? If the answer is none, the thought is not counsel. It is noise wearing the costume of concern. Name it as noise and much of its power dissolves on the spot. But the Stoics discovered something even deeper than the habit of repetition. They discovered that most overthinking is not really about the future at all. It is about something the mind refuses to say out loud. Lesson 2 asks, why does the mind overthink decisions that on the surface do not deserve the weight it gives them? Why can choosing what to say in an email consume an hour when the actual risk of getting it wrong is almost nothing? Seneca, writing to his friend Lucilius from a life spent among the anxious elite of Rome, observed that people suffer more in imagination than in reality. He was not being poetic. He had watched senators, men with real power and real enemies, undone not by their circumstances, but by their private rehearsals of disaster. The mind, left ungoverned, does not calibrate its fear to the actual size of the threat. It treats a minor social risk with the same intensity it would give a physical one, because to an old animal part of the brain, being wrong in front of others once meant expulsion from the tribe, and expulsion once meant death. This is what modern psychology calls threat inflation. The nervous system, built for a world of physical danger, applies its oldest and harshest alarm to situations that are merely uncomfortable. Your body cannot always tell the difference between a predator and a difficult conversation, so it prepares you for both with the same flood of dread. Here is the moment of recognition many will feel without wanting to say it aloud. You have spent more energy fearing a stranger's judgment than you have ever spent building anything you were proud of. The mind will overthink a text message for 20 minutes and abandon a meaningful project after 20 seconds of doubt. This is not proportion. This is a mind whose alarm system has never been recalibrated to the century it lives in. Seneca's remedy was not to suppress fear, but to interrogate it honestly. Ask what is the worst that could actually happen, then ask whether you could survive it. Nearly every time, the honest answer is yes. And the moment you admit that you could survive the worst case, the mind loses its favorite weapon, which was never the outcome itself, but your refusal to look directly at it. Picture a soldier who has never seen the battlefield, pacing behind the lines, imagining every possible ambush in vivid, sleepless detail, while the veteran beside him, who has actually faced the enemy, sleeps soundly because he has already measured the danger and found it survivable. Overthinking is the terror of the untested mind. Clarity is the calm of the mind that has finally dared to look. Take this with you before the next chapter begins. The next time a decision loops in your mind for the third or fourth time, do not ask, what if it goes wrong? Ask, could I survive it if it did? One question spirals, the other ends the spiral. Marcus Aurelius and Seneca had shown that the mind repeats itself out of habit and inflates threats out of an old animal fear. But even they knew there was a deeper root still waiting beneath both of these, a root Epictetus would spend his whole life pointing toward, from the moment he lost the freedom to control anything else at all. Epictetus began his life owning nothing, not even the right to his own body. As a slave in Rome, his leg was broken, some accounts say by his own master, testing how far the young philosopher's calm could be pushed. He did not scream, the story goes. He simply observed, almost with detachment, that the leg would break if the pressure continued. It broke. He is said to have remarked only that he had told him so. Whether the story is precise or embellished by later admirers, the philosophy it illustrates is not in question, because Epictetus built his entire teaching from that single brutal education. Control was the one thing that could never be stolen from him, because he had already surrendered every claim to anything else. This brings us to a deeper root beneath the two lessons already uncovered, a root that explains why the mind loops and inflates in the first place. Lesson 3 asks, why does the mind overthink most fiercely the very things it has no power to change? Consider what actually consumes the hours of a restless mind. Rarely is it the task in front of you. It is almost always something else. A decision someone else will make about you, an opinion already formed in another person's head, an outcome shaped by circumstances you cannot touch. The mind overthinks in direct proportion to how powerless it feels, as if enough mental effort might somehow reach across the gap and grip the uncontrollable by force. Epictetus named this confusion directly, in words that have outlived every empire that rose after him. Some things are up to us and some are not. He divided the entire world along this single line, not into good and bad, not into hard and easy, but into what belongs to your will and what does not. Modern psychology arrived at a similar map through a different route, describing a locus of control, the discovery that people suffer most and function worst when they direct their energy toward outcomes outside their influence, rather than the responses within it. The peace does not come from having more control. It comes from correctly locating where your control actually ends. Here is the recognition many will feel before they say it aloud. You have stayed awake fearing a decision that was never yours to make, that belonged entirely to another person's mind, another company's policy, another day's weather. The waiting itself became a second, invisible job, one you were never hired for and never paid for, and one that changed nothing about what was coming. Picture two gardeners standing at the edge of a field during a storm. One spends the night shouting at the clouds, certain that enough will and enough anger might change the weather by morning. The other walks inside, checks that the seedlings are covered, and sleeps. Not because he does not care about the harvest, but because he has already done everything that was his to do. The storm does not ask permission from either gardener. It only punishes the one who stayed outside to argue with it. The discipline Epictetus offers is not resignation. It is a daily sorting exercise. When a worry arrives, ask plainly, "Is this within my power to change right now?" If yes, act, and the overthinking ends the moment the action begins. If no, release it consciously, the way you would set down a stone you were never meant to carry the whole distance. Most overthinking is simply the refusal to perform this sort, carrying stones that belong to someone else's road. But even once the mind learns to sort control correctly, a second quieter trap remains, one that convinces you the sorting itself was never good enough. Lesson 4 asks a question few are willing to ask themselves directly. Why does the mind overthink even its own past decisions, long after they can no longer be changed? Musonius Rufus, the teacher who shaped both Epictetus and a generation of Roman Stoics, insisted that philosophy was not proven in calm classrooms, but in the daily test of ordinary conduct, that a person reveals their character in how they treat a decision once it is behind them. He taught that regret, endlessly replayed, is not wisdom continuing to work. It is the ego, refusing to accept that the version of you who chose was working with less than the version of you who now judges. This is what modern psychology names hindsight bias, the near-universal illusion that the outcome once known was somehow obvious all along, and that the past self should have seen it. The mind punishes its former self for not possessing information it could not have had. It is a court that convicts the defendant using evidence collected after the crime. You will recognize this without wanting to, replaying an old choice for the 100th time, certain that if you just examine it once more, the guilt will finally make sense and finally end. It never does, because the verdict was decided before the trial began. The mind had already chosen to punish you. The replaying is only theater to justify the sentence. Imagine judging a sailor's choice of course by a storm that had not yet formed on the map he was reading. He read the sky he had. He is not guilty of a storm that hadn't announced itself yet. Judge the decision by the information available at the time it was made, not by the wreckage visible only afterward. Musonius's practical instruction was to ask one honest question before allowing regret to continue. Did I act with the judgment available to me then? If yes, the file is closed, however the story ended. Overthinking the past is simply refusing to stamp a case as finished. Yet even here, the Stoics knew there was one figure still hiding behind every unresolved thought, the imagined witness whose judgment the mind is truly trying to overthink its way around. Cato the Younger walked through the streets of Rome dressed in mourning colors, in open protest of what the Republic had become, knowing perfectly well what the crowd whispered about him. He did not adjust his dress. He did not soften his positions to be better understood. Cicero himself, no stranger to political calculation, remarked that Cato behaved as if he lived in Plato's ideal republic rather than the corrupt city actually around him, meant as a criticism, and worn by Cato as something closer to an honor. He had made a decision most people never make consciously. He had chosen whose judgment mattered to him, and dismissed the rest as noise, however loud it grew. This brings us to the hidden witness beneath so much overthinking, the imagined audience the mind is constantly performing for, whether or not it will admit this to itself. Lesson 5 asks, why does so much overthinking take the shape of an imagined conversation with someone who is not even in the room? Notice the shape of your own rehearsals. You are rarely just thinking. You are explaining yourself to someone, a parent, a critic, a version of a coworker who has not actually said a word. The mind builds an entire courtroom, complete with a prosecutor, in order to defend a decision no one outside your own head has actually attacked. Psychology describes this as an imagined audience, the tendency to overestimate how much others notice, judge, and remember our choices, when in reality most people are absorbed in performing the identical anxious rehearsal about themselves. The audience you are so carefully performing for is, at that very moment, likely rehearsing their own imagined trial, with you nowhere in the room. Here is the moment of recognition. You have spent an evening composing the perfect defense of a decision, word for word, for a critic who, you later discover, never even noticed what you did. The court never convened. You built the entire trial, prosecuted yourself, and delivered the verdict, all without a single other person present. Picture an actor rehearsing lines for a play that has already closed. The theater is empty. The audience went home days ago, yet the actor stands alone on the dark stage, perfecting a performance no one will ever see. This is what it looks like to overthink for an audience that exists only in your own mind. Cato's discipline, stripped to its essence, was to ask, whose judgment have I actually agreed to answer to? Not everyone earns a vote in your internal court. Most of the voices you are defending yourself against were never granted a seat. You handed them the gavel yourself, and you can just as easily take it back. But even once the imagined audience is dismissed, one final and more difficult overthinking pattern remains. The fear not of what others think, but of what silence itself seems to demand be filled. Lesson 6 asks, why does the mind feel compelled to fill every open moment with thought, as if stillness were a problem waiting to be solved? Zeno of Citium, the founder of Stoicism, arrived in Athens as a shipwrecked merchant who had lost his cargo and, by most accounts, very nearly his fortune entirely. He wandered into a bookshop, heard a reader describe Socrates, and asked where he might find such a man. Instead of despairing over his ruin, he treated the disaster as an opening rather than a wound, famously reflecting later that he made a prosperous voyage when he was shipwrecked. He did not rush to fill the silence of his loss with frantic new plans. He let the emptiness show him something he could not have seen while his hands were full of cargo. Modern psychology has a name for our discomfort with unfilled time. Studies on solitude and rumination have found that many people would rather administer a mild, unpleasant experience to themselves than sit alone with their own thoughts for even a short period. Silence is treated less as rest and more as a vacuum the mind rushes to fill, with worry, with planning, with any thought at all, because an active worry feels safer than an unoccupied mind. You will know this moment. Reaching for your phone the instant a conversation pauses, not because you needed to check anything, but because the quiet itself felt unbearable, as though something might catch up with you if you allowed it to remain unfilled. Picture a pond disturbed by a stone. The ripples are natural, but if you keep dropping stones the moment the water starts to still, the pond can never show you your own reflection. The mind that never allows silence can never see itself clearly enough to stop overthinking in the first place. It can only ever see its own disturbance. Zeno's practical lesson was to treat silence not as a problem to solve, but as a room to sit in without immediately rearranging the furniture. When the urge arrives to fill a quiet moment with a new thought, let 10 seconds pass first. Most of what the mind rushes to fill silence with was never urgent. It was simply unfamiliar, yet even Zeno's stillness leaves one question unanswered. A question about time itself, and why the mind insists on living anywhere except the only place it can actually act. Marcus Aurelius returns to us now, older, further into the war, writing by lamplight after another day spent managing an empire that seemed to offer him nothing but new emergencies. He had every reason to dwell on the past, a life of loss, a body beginning to fail him, a son he worried for constantly, and every reason to escape into an imagined future where the war was finally over. Instead, he kept returning to a single, almost stubborn instruction to himself. This exact moment, and nothing else, is where your life is actually happening. This brings us to the question about time that Zeno's silence left open. Lesson 7 asks, why does the overthinking mind so rarely live in the only moment it can actually influence? Notice where your thoughts go when left unsupervised. Rarely to the room you are sitting in. Usually to a conversation that already happened, or one that has not happened yet. Anywhere, it seems, except the 10 square feet you currently occupy. The present moment is the one place where action is possible, and it is, strangely, the place the mind visits least. Marcus wrote to himself that a person could lose only the life they were living in this instant. since that is the only life anyone actually has, the past being gone and the future being uncertain. He was not offering comfort. He was pointing out a mathematical fact about where a life is actually lived, moment by moment, and nowhere else. Psychology describes something close to this in research on mind-wandering, which has found that people spend an enormous share of their waking hours thinking about something other than what they are doing, and that this wandering, regardless of whether the thoughts are pleasant or unpleasant, correlates with lower reported happiness than simply being absorbed in the present task, whatever it is. Here is the recognition. You have sat across from someone you love, nodding along, while your mind stood trial somewhere else entirely. A meeting tomorrow, an argument from last year, and the moment you were actually in, the only one you could have touched, slipped past unlived. Picture a man standing in a river, so busy calculating the currents downstream, and the currents already past that he never notices the water moving across his own hands right now. The river he is trying to master through calculation is the only river he will ever actually get to stand in. Marcus's discipline was simple and repeatable. When the mind drifts to a version of time it cannot act in, physically name one thing you can see, hear, or do right now. This is not a trick to relax you. It is a return to the only coordinates from which your will has ever had any power at all. But naming the present moment only holds if the mind has something solid to return to. And this is where our final principle begins. In the philosophy's most demanding teacher of all, Lesson 8 asks, why does overthinking finally lose its grip only once a person accepts something the ego resists more than any other idea, that they will not live forever, and that this fact is not a tragedy to escape, but a clarity to use? Marcus kept a phrase near him always. Roman generals were said to have whispered to themselves during their greatest triumphs, so that pride would not blind them. Remember that you will die, not as despair, as a corrective lens. He asked himself on difficult nights whether the thing keeping him awake would matter in 100 years, in 1,000, or even by the following spring. Almost nothing survived that question intact. Modern psychology, through work on mortality salience, has found that a clear-eyed awareness of life's limits does not have to produce dread. It can instead sharpen a person's sense of what actually deserves their attention, cutting away the trivial anxieties that only feel large because we imagine we have unlimited time to resolve them. You will recognize this the moment you allow yourself to. The argument that consumed your whole afternoon will not survive being asked whether it will still matter in a year. Almost none of them do. The mind inflates the size of a worry only because it assumes, quietly and falsely, that there will always be more time to deal with it later. Picture a candle burning in a room with the shutters closed, the owner arguing over which corner of the room deserves the light, never once opening the shutters to let in the sun that would end the argument entirely. Mortality is the opened shutter. It does not shorten your life by reminding you of its limit. It clarifies which corners of the room were never worth arguing over. Marcus's final discipline is the simplest of all. Before a worry is allowed to consume your evening, ask whether it will matter by the last day of your life. If it will not, you already have permission to set it down tonight. All 8 lessons now stand together. Repetition mistaken for progress, threat inflated beyond its size, control confused with the uncontrollable, regret judged by evidence unavailable at the time, an imagined audience granted a vote it was never owed, silence resisted instead of entered, the present abandoned for other tenses, and finally, the quiet clarity that time is not infinite. What remains is only the conclusion, the single truth that unites them. There is a scene worth returning to, one we have not yet placed in its proper light. Marcus Aurelius, alone in his tent, writing not for readers but for himself, was doing something every lesson in this film has quietly pointed toward without naming it directly. He was choosing deliberately to occupy his own mind rather than let it occupy him. Every principle we have uncovered, the loop that mistakes repetition for progress, the alarm that inflates a minor risk into a mortal one, the confusion between what is yours to change and what never was, the courtroom built for a judge who never took the bench, the silence treated as an enemy instead of a room to sit in, the drift away from the only moment where a life is actually lived, the clarity that arrives only once a person stops pretending they have unlimited time. All of it is really one truth wearing many disguises. The overthinking mind is not broken, it is simply ungoverned. It was built by nature to scan for danger, to replay, to imagine, to prepare, and left without direction, it will use that same machinery on problems that do not require it indefinitely, exhausting a life in the service of threats that were never as large as they were made to feel. The Stoics did not seek to silence this machinery, they sought to govern it, to decide deliberately where its considerable power would be spent, rather than leaving that decision to habit, fear, or an audience that was never watching as closely as it seemed. This is the quiet authority Marcus modeled from inside a war tent, that Epictetus modeled from inside a body that had already been broken once, that Zeno modeled from the deck of a ship that had already sunk beneath him. None of them overthought less because their lives contained less to think about. They overthought less because they had located, with total clarity, which thoughts deserved a seat at their table and which had simply wandered in uninvited. That is not a trick, and it is not a technique to master in a single evening. It is a daily act of governance, the same act, repeated, until it becomes who you are rather than something you do. The mind that governs itself does not stop thinking. It simply stops mistaking motion for progress, noise for danger, and imagined trials for real ones. What is left once the noise clears is not emptiness. It is room enough, finally, to live. If this brought you a moment of stillness, let it stay with you the next time your mind begins to circle. Stoicism was never meant to be watched once and forgotten. It was meant to be returned to, the way Marcus returned to his own words each night. Until we meet again in another video.